room full of candlelight and silk, they laughed at her dress. It was 19 years old, let out at the seams and repaired at the hem the night before, and every woman in Thornfield's assembly rooms saw it the moment she walked through the door. The laughter was not loud. It never was in polite society. It came through particular smiles, behind fans, in undertones pitched low enough to carry without seeming to. Imogen Langley heard it. A cold awareness settled in her chest, but she stood very still, her gaze fixed on the window across the room, refusing to acknowledge the cruelty. The Duke of Prescott heard it too. He had been standing at the far end of the hall, a glass of negus untouched in his hand, watching the room without appearing to watch anything at all. He set the glass down on the nearest surface. He straightened his coat. Then he crossed the room, not hurrying, because hurrying would have drawn attention to the laughter and sharpened what it meant. And he reached her side, and he held out his hand. She looked at it. She looked at him. Then she placed her hand in his, and he led her onto the floor, and the assembly rooms of Thornfield went entirely silent. This is the story of Imogen Langley, botanist, apothecary's assistant, and proud keeper of a dignity the world would rather see broken, and of Gideon Prescott, Duke of Prescott, who has spent 3 years holding a secret that is not entirely his alone, a debt of honor, a deed to a house, a letter from a dead man, and a pressed violet that has outlasted almost everything else. Between them stands a locked study and a vow made to a dying colonel in Portugal. Between them stands the question neither of them has yet found the courage to ask aloud. This story is a work of fiction, set in Regency England around 1814. All the characters and events here are imagined. Tell me in the comments where you are tonight. The country, the hour, whatever you like. I read everyone. Imogen Langley had not planned to attend the Thornfield assembly. She had planned to spend the evening cataloguing the last of the autumn specimens she had gathered on the heath, pressing stems flat between the pages of an old atlas, labeling each one in the small, precise hand her father had taught her when she was 7, and he had believed, against all convention, that a girl who could name every plant in a hedgerow was better equipped for the world than one who could not. She was 3 specimens behind. The atlas was nearly full. She preferred the work of plants to the work of society, always had, and she saw no particular reason to pretend otherwise. Her mother had other ideas. Margaret Langley had set out Imogen's grey silk evening gown with the determined patience of a woman who had learned not to argue directly. She laid it across the bed. She set out the long white gloves that covered the stain on Imogen's left wrist from the elderberry tincture she had been preparing for Mr. Crane's shop. She set out the pair of slippers she had resoled herself last spring, the stitching very nearly invisible. She said nothing at all, which was in its way worse than anything she might have said. The grey silk was 19 years old. It had been Margaret's, made in the last good year before Imogen's father left for Portugal, made in 1805, when Margaret had been a handsome woman in a house that was not cold in the evenings, and the coal merchant had not yet begun sending letters of a particular tone. High-waisted in the Regency fashion just arriving, ivory lace at the neckline, a narrow train that had since been removed because trains had gone out of fashion, and also because the hem had frayed past rescue. Imogen had let it out twice at the bodice to accommodate the fact that she was 3 inches taller than her mother, and broader in the shoulder. She had restitched the hem the night before by candlelight, squinting over her needle until her eyes ached, and the single tallow candle had burned to a stub. She had done all of this without complaint. She was not, in general, prone to complaint. Complaint required an audience, and she preferred to channel that energy into solutions. The grey silk was still clearly very old. She knew it the moment they entered the assembly rooms. The chandelier threw its light without discrimination over everything. The gowns of the wealthier women, their bright silk and embroidered gauze and Norwich shawls, the tired face of Mr. Frome the fiddler working his way through a country dance in the corner, and the grey gown of Miss Imogen Langley, repaired and altered and undeniably quietly present. The laughter was soft, almost inaudible. Miss Aldridge murmured something behind her fan to Miss Cartwright, leaning in with that particular intimacy that implied a shared understanding, a secret she was not privy to. Miss Cartwright's mouth curved just so, quick and small. Mrs. Aldridge, who was their mother, and ought by now to have achieved a more charitable temperament, did not quite manage to look away in time. Imogen heard it. She felt it the way she felt cold, as a physical fact, something landing against skin that had no choice but to receive it. She stood very still. Her hands were flat against her sides. Her chin was level. She looked across the room toward the window, as if she had caught sight of something genuinely interesting outside in the dark courtyard, which she had not. There was nothing outside but cobblestones and a yellow fog, and the shadow of a horse being walked past the gate. She looked at the fog with the concentrated attention of a woman who had decided that the only form of dignity available to her in this particular moment was stillness. She did not cry. She never cried in company. She had learned this from her father, who had been a colonel, and from her mother, who had been a colonel's wife, and between the two of them they had equipped her very well for the kind of suffering that is witnessed. She did not see the Duke cross the room. She heard him, in the sense that the conversation around her shifted in quality. A drop in volume, a slight repositioning of bodies, the particular quiet that settles when a man of consequence moves through a room, people parting without being asked. She registered it at the edges of her attention. She was about to turn and look for the source of the disturbance when she became aware of a presence at her left side. Close, deliberate, occupying the space with the certainty of a man who had made a decision and would not reconsider it. She turned. He was tall, dark coat, white cravat, no ornamentation beyond a plain silver ring on his right hand. His face was angular and still, the kind of still that is not absence of feeling but the management of a great deal of it. His eyes were tawny gold, bright, very direct, and fixed on her with an expression she could not immediately name. Not pity, she was certain of that. Something more deliberate. Something that looked improbably like determination. He held out his hand. She looked at it. She looked at him. She was aware of every person in the room watching. She put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm, certain, no hesitation at all. He led her onto the floor. The fiddle found its footing again. The set formed around them, and the assembly rooms of Thornfield went entirely remarkably silent for a full 7 seconds before the conversations resumed at a slightly different pitch than before. He did not speak until the figure brought them close enough for it. "You were about to leave," he said. His voice was low, not a question. "I was considering my options," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Almost a smile. "That is a gracious way of saying yes." It was the accurate way. "I find them usually the same." The figure separated them. When it brought them back together, he said, "You know who I am." "I know your name," she said. "That is not the same thing." He looked at her with what appeared to be genuine surprise, the blink of a man who had not expected to be answered with a distinction. The figure parted them again, and when they came together for the last movement of the dance, he said, "Miss Langley, I hope I have not made this worse." She understood what he was asking, whether the public nature of the gesture had sharpened the laughter rather than silenced it, given it a grander stage, a more satisfying target. She considered it honestly. The music around them, the floor under her repaired slippers, the sense of the room watching. "The laughter has stopped," she said. "That is something." "It is," he said. "I am glad of it." The music ended. He bowed. She curtsied. He offered his arm to walk her from the floor, and she took it, because refusing it here would have undone everything the dance had accomplished, and she was not a woman who undid things for the sake of pride. When they reached the edge of the room, he said quietly, his gaze toward the far wall, "I wonder if you might allow me to call tomorrow morning. There is a matter I would like to discuss with you. A professional matter." She turned to look at him. His expression was composed, careful. "A professional matter," she repeated. "Yes, nothing else. I should not presume to ask for anything else." She studied him for a moment. The stillness, the careful words. The fact that he had crossed a crowded room to offer her a way out of an embarrassment without making a spectacle of the embarrassment itself, and had asked nothing in exchange that she could identify. These were not the actions of a man who was owed something, or if he was owed something, he was better at concealing the expectation than most. "You may call," she said, "at 9 o'clock. My mother will be present." He inclined his head. Of course. He left shortly after. She watched him cross the room, that unhurried way of moving, taking up exactly the space required, no more, and she stood with the strange quality of the last 20 minutes sitting in her chest and tried to make sense of it. She could not, quite, but she felt very clearly that something had shifted, that the evening was not what she had thought it was when she had stood at the window looking at the fog. She did not know yet what it was instead. He arrived at 9 o'clock exactly. The Langley cottage was small, even by the measure of the village. 2 rooms below, 2 above, a kitchen that lost its heat in the wrong directions, and a garden that Imogen had slowly, methodically converted from ornamental to useful over 3 years. Herbs along the south wall where the sun stayed longest. Elderflower at the back, already harvested for the season. A tidy row of plantain near the gate, because plantain grew where it chose, and she had learned to cooperate with it rather than attempt to resist. She had trained a climbing rose against the front wall because her mother loved it, and the rose asked very little, and love asked very little either when the person you were loving was reasonable about it. She opened the door herself. They had no housemaid. She had prepared for this fact and felt no particular shame in it. He removed his hat and said good morning, without any of the elaboration men sometimes added to simple phrases when they were performing politeness rather than practicing it. He was wearing a dark grey coat, plain and well made, and he carried no cane or gloves, and he did not look at the cottage with the faintly pained expression that men of wealth sometimes brought to smaller houses, that particular grimace that tries to be invisible and never quite manages it. She showed him into the front parlour, where her mother was already seated with the good china set out on the small table, the fire built up, her posture the very picture of composed reception. Margaret Langley had been many things over 62 years of life. One of them was a woman who knew how to receive a duke without suggesting it was unusual. He stated his business directly. His ward, his niece, the daughter of his late brother, had been unwell for 3 weeks. She was 9 years old, named Dora, and she had begun with a simple cold that had settled in her chest. Dr. Emsley in Thornfield had attended twice and prescribed rest and warmth, and the child had not improved. He had not been satisfied with that, he said, and his voice when he said it was not dramatic, simply factual, the tone of a man who had examined a situation and found it inadequate. He had spoken with Mr. Crane, the apothecary on the High Street. Mr. Crane had said, "The person you want is Imogen Langley. She knows plants and preparations as well as any man in the county. She has managed her own household through illness these 3 years, without the resources that would make it easy, and she thinks clearly in a crisis, and she does not panic." Imogen sat with Mr. Crane's name hovering in the air between them. She had worked with Mr. Crane for 4 years, cataloguing specimens, preparing tinctures, attending to the particular work of matching plant knowledge to human need, and she trusted his judgment without reservation. She said, "What are the child's symptoms currently?" He described them with precision. The cough productive in the mornings, dry and catching by evening. The fever rising around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, highest at 8, breaking in the small hours and leaving the child damp and exhausted by morning. The breathing, shallow with a faint roughness on the left exhale that had developed in the last week. The appetite, almost gone. He described the sound of the worst breathing, the way someone describes a sound they have been listening to in the dark, memorizing it against their will. Imogen listened. She asked about the positions in which the child slept. She asked about the temperature of the sick room. She said, "It may be pleurisy or the beginning of it. The inflammation settles on one side. The fever pattern you describe and the one-sided breathing quality are consistent. It is treatable if it is caught early. It is not treatable by rest alone, which is why she has not improved." "No," he said, "I did not think so. I cannot confirm what I have not examined." "Of course, I'm asking only that you come to Prescott Hall and examine her. If you determine there is nothing to be done beyond Dr. Emsley's prescription, I will not press you further." She looked at him across the small table. He looked back. His expression did not have the quality of a man who expected the consultation to end with nothing further to be done. "And if I determine there is something to be done," she said, "then I would ask if you might stay and manage it. For as long as is necessary. Mr. Crane named a figure. I have asked my solicitor to double it. Her mother made a very small sound, swiftly suppressed. Imogen said, I do not want to be paid beyond the rate Mr. Crane named. He blinked. It was the first time she had caught him off guard, and she noted the quality of it, not offense, but genuine recalibration. The additional amount is not a gift, he said. It reflects the disruption to your own household from an extended absence. I am aware of what it reflects, she said. I do not want it. A brief pause. He said, Then you will accept the rate Mr. Crane named. If the work is genuine and the child genuinely needs attending, yes. He accepted this without argument. No pushing, no explanation, no attempt to convince her that she was being unreasonable. He simply adjusted the position and moved forward. She noticed this, the lack of argument. In the particular way she noticed things that surprised her, with a small internal notation filed under further observation required. She asked for half an hour to prepare. He said he would wait outside. He did wait outside. She saw him from the upstairs window, standing in the lane with his horse, examining the elderflower hedge with the focused attention of someone who actually knew what they were looking at. She stood at the window for a moment longer than she needed to. Her mother appeared at her shoulder with the soundlessness she had perfected over decades. Well, Margaret said. He has a sick child, Imogen said. That is the matter. He also crossed a room full of people last night to be inconvenient on your behalf, her mother said, without being asked and without making it about himself. That is separate, is it? Yes, Imogen said, and went to pack her bag. The road to Prescott Hall was 7 miles through early autumn countryside, the leaves beginning to turn at the margins of the beech woods, the fields stubbled and grey under a low sky that smelled of coming rain. He rode alongside the hired chaise and did not attempt conversation through the window, which she appreciated. The journey gave her time to think, and she used it. Prescott Hall was large in the way of houses that have grown over several centuries, without any single owner having the resolve to say, enough. Wings had been added, corridors extended, a library built onto the east end that was slightly misaligned with the original structure. The stone was old and dark, and the gardens were somewhat overgrown in the way of a house whose master cares about what happens inside it more than what the borders look like from the lane. Mrs. Halkett met her at the door, a woman of 60 with a face that gave nothing away and eyes that were taking in everything. She said, Miss Langley, we are glad of your help. She said it with perfect correctness. Her expression was not entirely certain it agreed. Imogen was shown upstairs immediately. Dora Prescott was small for 9 years old, with dark hair spread across the pillow and eyes that were too bright with fever. The particular brightness that sits just behind the irises when the body is working too hard at too many things at once. She was lying on her side when Imogen entered the sick room, and she turned at the sound of the door with an effort that suggested even turning was costing her something. Are you a doctor? She said. Her voice was hoarse and direct. I am not, Imogen said. She set her bag on the chair beside the bed without ceremony. I am a naturalist. I know a great deal about plants and what they can and cannot do for the body. May I listen to your breathing? Dora regarded her with the seriousness of a child who is unwell but not frightened, which is a particular quality, and one Imogen had learned to read as a sign of a basically sturdy constitution. Dr. Emsley does not listen, she said. He looks at me from across the room and writes things in his book. I will need to be considerably closer than that. That is better, then. Imogen examined her for 20 minutes. She did it thoroughly and without haste. The breathing, the temperature at the brow and throat and wrist, the quality of the cough when it came. She pressed gently along the lower left ribs and watched Dora's face carefully. The small wince quickly controlled. She smelled the child's breath, which told her things. The slightly sweet edge of a sustained fever, the faint sourness of a body that had not eaten enough in several days. She asked Dora to take a deep breath and listened to what happened when she tried. The breathing catches on the left side, she said. Yes, Dora said. It has for 5 days. I did not tell Uncle Gideon how many days because he worries. He should know, Imogen said. Dora considered this. He knew anyway, she admitted. He counts the days himself. Imogen stood and turned to the doorway, where the Duke had been standing for the entirety of the examination, without speaking or moving. His presence was very still, the kind of stillness that is not emptiness, but restraint, the particular posture of a man watching something frightening, holding himself motionless because movement would not help, and he was the sort of man who only did things that helped. She looked at him directly. "It is pleurisy," she said. "Early stage. The inflammation is in the left pleural space. She needs the room ventilated. It is too warm and too closed, and warm, stagnant air is making the breathing more difficult than it needs to be. She needs elderflower and yarrow infusions, properly prepared every 6 hours, to bring the fever down in a sustainable way. Not the cold compresses I see the housemaid has been using, which suppress it temporarily and then allow it to spike again when removed. She needs to eat in small amounts soft food, every few hours regardless of appetite. And she needs someone with her through the night, because the breathing will be at its most difficult between midnight and 4 o'clock, and she should not be alone in it." He listened to all of this without interrupting, without a single word of qualification or doubt. "Then can you manage it?" "Yes." "Then will you stay?" She looked at Dora, who had fallen into the shallow, sudden sleep of the feverish young, abrupt and complete, one moment present, the next gone, her face in sleep, losing the careful control she had maintained during the examination, becoming soft and very young. Her breathing rattled faintly on the exhale, but her face was not distressed. "Yes," Imogen said, "I will stay." She sent Mrs. Halkett for the preparations she needed, and when Mrs. Halkett returned with white yarrow instead of common, explained the difference quietly and without condescension, which was a distinction she made as a matter of principle. Not all ignorance is carelessness, and the woman had not been given adequate instructions by the previous attendant. Mrs. Halkett went back for the correct variety, with the expression of a woman treated fairly, adjusting to the novelty of it. The first night was the worst. The fever spiked just after 2 o'clock. Dora woke coughing, gasping slightly on the in-breath, her eyes wide and confused with that particular confusion of fever, not knowing for a moment where she was or why breathing required so much effort. Imogen was beside her immediately. She sat on the edge of the bed, not standing over her, and she spoke in the low, steady voice she used when she was in Mr. Crane's shop and a patient was frightened. Calm, factual, present. She talked about plants. The yarrow in the kitchen garden and why it was called milfoil. 1,000 leaves, she explained, because of the way the leaf divides and divides. The way elderflower smelled in June, sweet and slightly dusty, nothing like what you would expect from something that became a medicine. The shape of plantain, broad and flat and stubborn, growing in paths and doorways, growing in exactly the places where it was least welcome, growing there anyway. Dora listened. Her breathing slowed by increments. By 3 o'clock the fever broke. The damp of it came out through the skin, and Imogen changed the pillow and the upper sheet and sat with her hand on Dora's wrist, feeling the pulse slow and even, for another half-hour until she was certain. By morning Dora was sitting up. She wanted porridge, she said, and also she wanted to know if plantain was good for anything or if it was only a weed, because it sounded like only a weed. Imogen told her that plantain was good for wounds and infections and respiratory ailments, that its leaves had been used in medicine for at least 2,000 years, and that things that grew stubbornly in undesirable places were often the most useful things there were. Dora appeared to find this philosophically satisfying. The Duke appeared in the doorway at 7 o'clock, already dressed, clearly not having slept, the tiredness held at a careful distance from his expression by an act of will, visible if she looked for it. He saw his niece sitting up, and something in his face underwent a change so complete and so involuntary that it was almost uncomfortable to witness. 3 weeks of held tension released in a single, unguarded moment. He crossed the room and crouched beside the bed, so that he was speaking to Dora at her level, not from above. She touched his sleeve and said, "Did you know yarrow is called milfoil because of the leaves?" He said he had not known that. She said, "Miss Langley told her." He looked up briefly at Imogen. She looked at the window. "Thank you," he said quietly. "She will need 10 more days of the infusions," Imogen said. "The inflammation resolves slowly. I would like to remain and manage it." "Of course." "I am not asking for permission, I am stating a plan." There was a pause. He said, "Of course," again with a different weight to it. Not a grant, but an agreement, which was not the same thing. She noted the distinction. Over the next 10 days, Prescott Hall settled into a pattern. Imogen spent the mornings with Dora and the afternoons in the kitchen garden and the surrounding grounds, gathering what she needed and cataloguing what she found, because she could not help cataloguing. It was her way of understanding a place, of taking its measure. The walled kitchen garden was exceptionally well planted for a house managed by a bachelor duke. Someone had made decisions in it based on real knowledge. Not a steward following a list, but someone who understood aspect and soil, and the difference between plants that grew together well and plants that did not. She began spending the evenings in the library, after Dora was settled. The first evening the Duke found her there, she expected the awkwardness of an unanticipated meeting, the small social machinations required to establish that she was not overstepping, that the library was available to her, that she had a right to be reading. He came in looking for a map. She explained herself in 2 sentences, and he said, "The library is for using," set down his coat on the nearest chair, located his map, and left. 15 minutes later, he returned with 2 cups of tea and placed one on the table beside her, without asking whether she wanted it. She drank it. It was exactly right. He sat in the armchair across the room with his map and his own cup, and read without speaking. She read without speaking. At the end of an hour, she noted that his silence was comfortable, not requiring anything of her, not pressing, the kind of quiet that belonged to a person sufficient to themselves, and not made anxious by the presence of another person equally sufficient. The next evening he came again, and the next. By the 4th evening they were talking. The walled kitchen garden lay behind the east wing of Prescott Hall, sheltered on 3 sides by old brick that held the warmth of whatever sun there was well into the October afternoons. Imogen had been working in it daily for a week before she found the labels. They were wooden stakes painted white, driven into the soil at intervals along the row she had begun to think of as the physic corner, the section planted with medicinal specimens, running along the south-facing wall where the light was best. The labels were small, and the handwriting on them was smaller, written in a particular ink she knew because she had mixed it herself. A combination of oak gall and iron with a small amount of shellac that set harder than ordinary ink and survived better through wet seasons. She had developed the formula in the summer of 1812 and used it throughout the following autumn on precisely these kinds of plant labels because it lasted. She was looking at her own handwriting. Digitalis purpurea, common foxglove, Langley Park, summer 1812. She held the stake in both hands and read it again. Her writing, her formula, her notation, the genus and species first, the common name second, the location and date of origin third, because that was how she catalogued. That was the system she had established in the summer of 1812, when she had begun the systematic documentation of the physic garden at Langley Park. In the last months before the estate was put up for sale, and she had understood, with the cold clarity of someone who had been doing arithmetic for a while and could no longer avoid what the numbers say, that they would not be keeping it. She had labelled every specimen in the physic garden that summer. She had used these stakes and this ink, and she was looking at one of those stakes in the kitchen garden of Prescott Hall. She moved along the row. Another stake, Valeriana officinalis, common valerian, Langley Park, summer 1812. Another, Symphytum officinale, comfrey, Langley Park, summer 1812. Everyone in her hand, her ink, her format, not seeds, not cuttings grown from seed. Actual plants, carefully transplanted. Someone had taken the physic garden from Langley Park, before or during the estate sale, and brought it here to Derbyshire 7 miles away, and planted it against the south wall of the kitchen garden, and kept it alive for 2 years. Someone who had known which specimens mattered, and in what order and how to transport them without losing the root systems. Someone who had kept her labels. She stood in the kitchen garden for a long time. The autumn light moved over the brick wall and the rows of carefully tended plants, and she stood in it with the stake in her hand, and felt something she could not quite name, not quite any single emotion, but a compound of several pressing against each other. She went to find Mrs. Halkett. Mrs. Halkett was in the still room with an inventory and a cloth. She looked up when Imogen appeared in the doorway, and something moved across her face, small, careful, and quickly managed. "The labels in the physic corner," Imogen said. "They are from Langley Park." "Are they?" said Mrs. Halkett. "They are in my handwriting, Mrs. Halkett. My ink, my notation. These are from the garden I catalogued in the summer of 1812. Mrs. Halkett set down the cloth. She looked at Imogen with the expression of a woman who was deciding between two kinds of honesty and choosing the one that served best. "You should speak with His Grace," she said. Not evasively, with something almost like relief, as though she had waited for this question and was glad to direct it where it belonged. "It is not mine to explain." "Did he ask you to keep it from me?" "No," she said. "He asked nothing of the kind. It simply was not my place to raise it unprompted." Imogen returned to the house. She found him in the stables, examining the near hoof of a grey mare with the focused calm of a man who had done this many times and felt no need to perform competence for an audience. He looked up when she appeared around the stable door. She said, "The physic corner, explain it." He was quiet for a moment. He handed the mare's hoof to the groom and straightened. They walked to the terrace. The grounds fell away below, the long grass silver with frost still not quite cleared, the fields beyond, the tree line. He stood with his hands behind his back and looked at the view as though he had looked at it many times and was still not entirely sure what to do with it. He said, "The plants were offered at the estate sale. The agent was disposing of the contents of the physic garden along with the furniture and the contents of the house. I purchased the medicinal section." She looked at him. "You were at the sale of Langley Park?" "Yes. And you purchased the physic garden?" "The medicinal section. The ornamentals I did not care for." "Why?" He looked at the grounds. They seemed worth preserving. "That is not an answer." He turned and looked at her directly. His eyes were very clear in the October light. "No," he agreed. "It is not." She waited. She was good at waiting. She had learned patience from plants, which did not rush. He said, "There are things I would like to tell you, Miss Langley. I am not yet certain that I have found the right way to tell them." She studied his face. What she saw there was not evasion for its own sake, not the expression of a man concealing something for personal advantage. It was the expression of someone carrying a weight held a long time, uncertain how to put it down without dropping it and causing damage. That was a specific kind of look. She had seen it before in her own mirror 3 years ago. She said, "The right way will need to present itself eventually." "I know," he said. "Yes." She went back to Dora. That evening in the library she was quieter than usual, and he was quieter too, and the quality of the quiet was different from before, charged not with hostility, but with the awareness of something approaching. She read the same paragraph of her botanical monograph 4 times and retained none of it. He turned pages at regular intervals, but she was not certain he was reading. At some point he said without looking up, "She is almost well." 4 more days, Imogen said. "Then the inflammation should be sufficiently resolved." He turned a page. "And after that?" She thought of the cottage, the leaking section above her bedroom window that needed attention before November, the coal merchant's letters of particular tone, her mother's careful silence over a laid-out dress. "After that I will go home," she said. He said nothing. The fire settled. Between them on the table, both their cups had gone cold. She found it on the 12th morning. She had been in the library looking for a copy of Curtis's botanical magazine she had noticed on the lower shelf a week earlier, a volume from 1810 that contained a monograph she wanted to check a detail against. She found it, and in drawing it out she dislodged its neighbour, a slim atlas of garden designs that slid sideways and knocked against the shelf end, and the shelf end, which she now saw was in fact the edge of a connecting door, swung inward by 3 inches. She stopped. Through the gap she could see the edge of a desk, papers arranged with a particular order, a window with a different aspect than the library's own, a working room. She stood with her hand on the spine of the botanical magazine and looked at the gap. Then she drew it shut and replaced the atlas and went back to her chair. She sat for 10 minutes, reading not a word. She stood up. She crossed to the shelf. She opened the connecting door. The study was clearly his working room rather than any formal space. Papers in a careful private order, a set of books marked at several places, maps folded on a stand. A desk used frequently and recently, its surface worn to a particular smoothness where his hands rested when he wrote. A locked glass cabinet along the far wall that she did not approach. The room smelled of old paper and ink and wood smoke, and faintly of the particular smell that attached to objects that had been handled often by the same pair of hands over many years. She was about to step back when she saw the roll of paper on the edge of the desk. The paperweight had slipped. The roll was beginning to curl back on itself. Without thinking, and the reflex of someone who had spent years preventing papers from rolling away and being damaged, she reached out and pressed her hand flat against it to hold it open, and then she looked at what it showed. A floor plan, drawn with considerable skill in a hand she did not recognize, but annotated throughout in a hand she knew so well it was like reading her own thoughts. Her father's handwriting, with its distinctive L, the long descending tail she had tried to replicate as a child and never quite managed. Every room labelled: the entrance hall, the morning room, the drawing room to the south, the garden door, the east passage she had used as a child to move between the kitchen and the library without being seen. The library she had read in every wet afternoon for 16 years. The bedroom that had been hers, labelled in her father's hand with its familiar name. At the bottom of the page, beneath the careful lines of the plan, for Gideon, as promised. July 1813. She stood holding the edge of the desk. Her father had drawn a floor plan of her childhood home and addressed it to this man by his first name, in July of 1813, 2 months before her father died. She heard footsteps in the passage outside the study door. He came in and stopped in the doorway. The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then he crossed the room, not rushing, not sharp about it, and took the floor plan from under her hands with the same deliberate care with which she had seen him handle the hoof of the grey mare, the care of someone handling something that mattered. He held it without rolling it. She said, "That is Langley Park." "Yes." "My father drew it." "Yes." July 1813. Her voice was very steady. She made it so. "He died in September of 1813. He said nothing. He drew you a floor plan of my childhood home and addressed it to you by your given name, in the months before he died." She looked at his face. He was not going to deny it, she could see that. He was also not going to confirm it in the 3 seconds available in this room, in this manner, with her standing at his desk, having entered without invitation. "Who are you to my father?" she said. The words came out more raw, like the edge of something uncovered. He set the floor plan down on the desk. He said, "I will explain everything, I promise you that. But not like this and not today. What I have to tell you is significant. It requires more than a few minutes in a room you should not have entered." She should have been angry at the last sentence. She was, in fact, slightly angry, but she was watching him very carefully, and what she saw in his face as he said it was not reproach. It was grief. Old, controlled, very thoroughly managed grief, with the quality of something that had been pressed flat for a long time and has not gone away. "When?" she said. "When Dora is well, and your professional engagement here is concluded. I do not want what I have to say entangled with your work. Your work should remain clean of it." She stared at him. "You are protecting the professional relationship." "I am trying to protect you," he said, "imperfectly possibly, but that is what I am trying to do." She left the study. She returned to Dora. She sat beside the child's bed and listened to her breathe and did not think about the floor plan or the handwriting or the date. July 1813, 2 months before her father died, with any success at all. She did not sleep well that night. The letter arrived on the 14th morning. Mrs. Halkett brought it up with the breakfast tray and set it beside the teapot with the expression of a woman who had examined a question from several angles and found no legitimate grounds on which to withhold correspondence addressed to a guest of the house, even correspondence she clearly did not trust. Imogen broke the seal. Lord Percival Norwood wrote in the manner of someone who considered directness a weapon and wished the recipient to understand, before reading further, that the weapon was already drawn. He was direct in the way that certain men are direct when they believe they hold every card, and the person they are addressing holds none, and this is simply a courtesy notification of that fact. He wrote that he was aware of her current situation, a young woman of reduced circumstances, residing in the house of an unmarried duke, the arrangement brokered by a local tradesman and conducted without formal contract or appropriate chaperonage, in a household with no female relative of the duke's present. He wrote that he understood she had been brought in to attend a sick child. He did not doubt the explanation. He was not, however, certain that the county would share his charitable interpretation. He wrote that her late father had incurred debts before his death in Portugal, debts that had been, with great patience and consideration, allowed to remain dormant in deference to the family's grief. He wrote that these debts, with interest as accumulated, now represented a sum sufficient to have justified a claim on the Langley Park estate, which had been sold, he noted, without discharging the original obligation in full. He had, some time ago, purchased these debt notes from the lending institution that had issued them. The matter remained, legally speaking, unresolved. He intended to call at Prescott Hall on Wednesday morning to discuss the matter with her directly. He expected the Duke of Prescott to be present. The Duke had, he wrote, some questions of his own to answer. She read the letter twice. She folded it with precise, flat folds. She went downstairs. She found the Duke at the writing desk in the morning room, working through correspondence in the early light. She placed Norwood's letter on the desk in front of him and said, "Read this." He read it. His face changed in a way she had not seen before. Not surprise. He recognized the name. She could tell that immediately. There was no moment of confusion or unfamiliarity. Not anger, not exactly. Something colder and more deliberate than anger. The expression of someone who had anticipated an approach from a particular direction and was now watching it arrive. "You know about the debt," she said. "Yes." "You know about Lord Norwood?" "Yes." "Tell me what you know." He set the letter down. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, she thought, but locating the right point to begin. He said, "The debt is not valid. The underlying obligation was discharged at the time of the estate sale. The notes Norwood holds are not legally actionable." He says they are. He is mistaken about the nature of the original transaction. The context in which the money was borrowed is, I cannot give you the full account yet. But I can tell you that the sale discharged what was owed, and Norwood acquired those notes knowing they were void. He is relying on the reasonable assumption that your family has neither the legal resources nor the documented evidence to challenge him. She sat down across from him. She looked at the letter on the desk between them. She looked at him. She said, "Gideon." She used his name deliberately, carefully, to see whether he met it or deflected from it. He met it, steadily, without flinching. "Yes," he said. "Tell me about Langley Park. The sale. What happened?" He held her gaze. He said, "I bought it." She absorbed this. "You," she said. "Yes." "You bought my family's home." "I did." "Why?" He said, "Miss Langley." He stopped. He said her name again, slightly differently, Imogen, as if testing whether it was the right time for it. Then, "There is a great deal I have been trying to tell you, and I have been handling the timing very badly. Norwood's letter has removed the luxury of finding a better moment. When he comes on Wednesday, you need to understand certain things before he does. I will not be able to explain all of it before then, but I will tell you enough." He told her the debt had been incurred not for personal use, but under circumstances that made it unenforceable against the family, circumstances involving a third party, now dead. The estate sale had legally resolved the outstanding obligation. The house had been purchased at auction at significant personal cost. She said, "By you." "By me," she said. "For what purpose?" He looked at the desk, at the letter, at her. He said, "The house was purchased with the intention of returning it." "To whom?" He said nothing. She said, To me." He was quiet, but his silence was not a denial. It was a confirmation held back by a question of timing or method he was still working through. She sat in the morning room with the sound of the house around her and looked at this man who had bought her family's home and maintained it, empty, for 2 years, and she tried to locate the correct word for what she felt. She could not find one. There were several candidates and they were contradictory, and she was a woman who distrusted conclusions she could not support with observation. She said, "Wednesday. We will manage Norwood on Wednesday." "Yes." She stood. "And then you will tell me everything." "Yes," he said. "Everything." Lord Percival Norwood arrived at Prescott Hall at 11 o'clock on Wednesday morning, which was an hour earlier than he had specified in his letter, and with 2 men accompanying him rather than 1. A local bailiff named Greer, whom the Duke clearly recognized from some previous engagement, and a younger man carrying a leather satchel of documents, who had the look of someone engaged to be an official witness and was not entirely comfortable in the role. Imogen was in the entrance hall when they arrived. She had chosen to be. She had dressed carefully that morning in the better of her 2-day dresses, had arranged her hair without assistance, and had positioned herself slightly behind the Duke and to his left, a position that stated, "I am present, I am observing, and I intend to remain so." Norwood was a large man in his 50s, florid-faced, well-dressed in the manner of someone who had spent many years ensuring that money was visible on him. He had the confidence of a man who had rarely encountered anyone with sufficient resource or motivation to tell him no, and his look at Imogen when he entered was the look of a man who assessed an opponent in 3 seconds and filed them under. Not a significant variable. He addressed the Duke first. He laid out his position in efficient, pleasant language. The debt notes, with their accumulated interest, representing a prior claim on the Langley estate that predated and superseded the auction sale. He had purchased these notes in good faith from the issuing bank. The estate sale, while legally conducted, had not discharged the underlying obligation in full. He was therefore owed, and the manner in which that obligation was discharged was a matter he was prepared to discuss in a spirit of good faith today. His eyes moved to Imogen at intervals during this recitation. Each time they did, they contained a suggestion that his good faith had dimensions she might wish to consider privately. The Duke listened without a flicker of expression. Then he said, "Greer." The bailiff shifted his weight. The Duke said, "Your authorization for this visit. Who issued it?" Greer said, Lord Norwood had retained his services as a private matter, not in an official county capacity. The Duke said, "I see. I should mention, in that case, that I have in my possession a signed affidavit from Mr. Alderton, the county magistrate, regarding the specific circumstances of your retainer, including the nature of the transaction by which you were engaged." He paused. "You are welcome to review it." Greer said nothing. His weight shifted again. Norwood said, "This was a question of clear legal right, and the Duke could produce whatever documents he chose." The simple fact remained. The Duke excused himself and walked to his study. He returned carrying a flat wooden box locked, which he set on the hall table and opened with a small key from his coat pocket. From the box he withdrew a document, and he offered it to Norwood with the calm of a man handing over evidence that has never been in any doubt. "The registered deed to Langley Park," he said, "purchased at open auction in September of 1812 for a sum in excess of the full stated value of the debt notes, which discharged any outstanding obligation under the terms of the original lending agreement. The solicitor's opinion confirming this, both in the matter of the discharge and in the matter of the validity of any subsequent secondary purchase of those notes, is the second document in the box. You are welcome to read it." Norwood read the deed. He read it with the expression of a man who had prepared for several responses, but not this one. His color did not change, but something behind his eyes did. He said, "This did not address the separate matter of Miss Langley's situation. A young woman living unchaperoned in a bachelor's household was a matter the county would form views about, regardless of documentation." These things had a way of persisting. He was looking at Imogen as he said it. The room was quiet. She felt the words as a physical thing, the particular sensation of a threat delivered pleasantly in public by a man who was certain she had no recourse and who was watching her face for the particular expression that would tell him he was right. She said, "Lord Norwood." He looked at her. She said, "You purchased debt notes that had already been discharged, knowing they were void, and attended this house with a private bailiff under the pretense of official capacity for the purpose of coercion. These are not qualities I would expect to find in a man whose opinion of my reputation I would find worth considering. I would also note that Mrs. Halkett has served as chaperone throughout my engagement here, that my employment is fully documented at the rate agreed with Mr. Crane of Thornfield High Street, and that Mr. Alderton was made aware of my professional engagement here before I arrived." Norwood's expression went very still. He stepped forward and reached past the Duke toward the deed box on the table. The Duke was there before his hand arrived, one hand on the lid, the other at Norwood's wrist and not gripping, simply present, a physical fact that required no elaboration. "No," the Duke said. "Very quiet." The word landed in the entrance hall like something set down with care. In the silence that followed, wheels could be heard on the gravel drive. The front door opened. Mr. Alderton, the county magistrate, entered, accompanied by two of his own men in his official capacity, having ridden out from Thornfield that morning in response to a message sent the previous evening. He was a short, composed man with a grey coat and a methodical quality of attention. He looked at Norwood, at Greer, at the deed box on the table, at the Duke, at Imogen. He said, "Your Grace, I understand there is a matter I can assist with." "There was," the Duke said. "I believe it is concluding now." Mrs. Halkett appeared at the far end of the entrance hall with a tea tray, moving with the unhurried purpose of a woman who had managed difficult situations in this house before and intended to manage this one also. Lord Norwood was escorted from Prescott Hall within the half hour, with his two men, his leather satchel, and his void debt notes, which Mr. Alderton's office would be examining at leisure over the following days. Greer went with them without speaking to anyone. The door of Prescott Hall closed. The entrance hall was very quiet. He asked her to come to the morning room. She sat. He stood at the window for a moment, looking at the terrace and the fields below, and then he turned and sat across from her, not behind the desk, as he had been the previous week, but in the chair beside it, which was closer, and offered him no surface to position between himself and the conversation. He said, "There is no good way to say what I need to say. I have spent 3 years looking for one, and I do not believe it exists. I think I have been using the search as a means of delay." She folded her hands in her lap and said nothing. She gave him the room she would give any careful piece of reasoning, time to arrive in its own order. He said, "From 1810 to 1813 I was not in any practical sense primarily a duke. My brother held the title and the estate. I was engaged unofficially through certain branches of the government in work I cannot fully describe even now, military intelligence in the broadest sense, in Portugal principally, under a name that was not my own." She was still. He said, "Your father, Colonel Langley, was my contact in Lisbon, my handler, the person I reported to and through whom my information moved. He knew who I was. He was one of perhaps 4 people in Lisbon who did." He paused. The fire in the morning room made a small sound. Outside, a bird called once in the ash tree and was quiet again. He said, "He was an extraordinary man, your father. Not in the dramatic sense, he did not perform bravery. He was simply consistently more reliable than circumstances ever deserved. He protected my cover on 2 separate occasions when I was careless in ways that would have cost me and others significantly. He never reproached me for either lapse. He simply managed what needed managing and moved on." She said nothing. Her chest felt full of something that was not quite any named emotion, a pressure without a clear shape. He said, "In the spring of 1813, in a street in Lisbon, I will not specify the location or the circumstances more than this, because some of it remains a matter of ongoing sensitivity. There was an incident, an ambush directed at me, because my cover had been partially compromised by that point, and certain parties wished to ensure I did not return from that particular errand." He stopped. He looked at the window. He forced himself to look back at her. He said, "Your father was with me when it happened. He was not supposed to be. He had come to deliver a message at a location near the route I was using, and he had stayed to walk back toward the consulate because the weather had turned, and he had, I believe, some concern about me that he was not prepared to name directly. He put himself between me and what was coming, not dramatically, not with any announcement. He simply moved to a different position in the space, and he was where I had been. Her hands folded in her lap, pressed against each other. He said, "A blow meant for me caught him across the left shoulder and chest. He did not go down. He stayed on his feet and he kept walking, and he did not say at the time that anything significant had occurred. He told me it was nothing, he was wrong." She said, "He developed fever." He looked at her. "Yes, 2 months later. It may have been related to the injury. An untreated deep bruise to the chest wall can create complications, especially in an unhealthy climate over a prolonged period. It may have been any one of several fevers that moved through Lisbon that summer, which were numerous and not discriminating. I cannot tell you with certainty. I have thought about it many times." She said, "Were you still in Lisbon when he died?" "No. I was recalled to England in August of 1813 to take up the dukedom after my brother died in July. I left before your father's condition worsened significantly. I did not know that he would not recover." He stopped. "I should have known. I knew what the injury was, and I knew the climate, and I should have been more concerned than I allowed myself to be. I left because I had obligations in England that could not wait, and I told myself that he had survived worse and would survive this. I was wrong." The morning room held them both in the kind of quiet that followed a thing said that could not be unsaid. He said, "I received a letter from him in October, written in September in the last weeks of his illness. It reached me here in Derbyshire, 3 weeks after his death. The timing it was very bad timing. There was no answer I could send." He rose. He went to the locked cabinet in the study. The connecting door was still open from when she had found the floor plan, and returned with a letter. The original seal was broken and had been resealed with new wax, layered over the old. The paper at the fold lines was worn soft, handled many times. He held it out without comment. She took it. She broke the resealed wax. The paper unfolded with the particular ease of something opened and refolded many times. Her father's handwriting. The long L, the cramped lowercase a, the slightly compressed script of a man who wrote quickly but precisely, as she imagined a man might write when uncertain how much time remained and with things to say. She read. Her father wrote that he had done some calculations and believed he was unlikely to return from Lisbon in his current condition. He wrote, "You need not feel responsible. I made the choices that led me to that street, and I would make them again without hesitation, knowing the outcome." He wrote, "I have asked Mr. Partridge to send this with the official dispatch so it reaches you before the formal notification, because I want you to hear it from me first." He wrote, "I am enclosing a small thing, a violet from the garden of the house where I have been staying. The same species grows in the lane outside our cottage, and Imogen has been pressing them since she was 7. I thought it fitting. I am sending her the same." Then her father's handwriting changed slightly. The same hand, but a different pressure, a different quality of deliberateness, as though he had set down the pen and picked it up again. He wrote, "I promised you I would ask nothing of you when this was over, and I intend to keep that promise. But I will exercise one small liberty, since I am dying, and it seems the moment is as good as I am likely to get. Gideon, look out for her if you can, and if it comes to it, not from obligation, only if it comes to it. She is very capable, but the world is not always kind to capable women without resources, and I will not be there to be inconvenient on her behalf." Then, unmistakably, her father's particular habit of ending serious things with a jest, because that was how he had been made. She could hear his voice in it as clearly as if he were in the room. "I, Colonel Robert Langley, do hereby extract from the aforesaid Gideon Prescott, Duke of Prescott, his solemn and binding promise to be inconvenient on behalf of Imogen Langley at such times as it may be required, in acknowledgement of an unspecified kindness rendered in a Lisbon street in the spring of 1813. This promise is enforceable under the laws of common decency, which I have every reason to believe you take seriously." He had signed it. He had left a blank line below his signature. She sat with the letter for a long time. She read it twice more, the formal part, the joke, the blank line. She read the line about the violet. She reached into her medicine case. She opened the inner pocket, the small one, stitched separately, where she kept the things she did not want to lose. She removed a piece of paper, folded small, and folded again. She unfolded it with the care she gave to anything that could not be replaced. Inside was a pressed violet, perfectly flat, the petals still slightly purple at their edges, dried to near transparency but intact. The stem a fine brown line, the whole thing preserved by the careful hands of a 17-year-old who had pressed violets since she was 7 and knew how to do it correctly. Her father had sent her a letter in October of 1813, shorter than this one, far less formal, containing only the things a father says to a daughter he loves and does not expect to see again. And the violet, from the garden of a house in Lisbon. He had told her it was the same species that grew in the lane outside their cottage. He had told her to keep it. She held the violet in her palm and looked at the Duke. He reached across the desk and opened the other letter, his own copy already open, the paper more worn than hers, and she saw it there, a pressed violet, slightly more faded, its petals thinned with time to near paper, but whole. He had kept his. She looked from one to the other. The two violets pressed from the same patch of Portuguese garden, kept by two different people over 3 years across 2 different distances. She said, "He thought it was funny." He did. His voice had something in it she had not heard before, a kind of tender grief not quite under control, the sound of something that has been held carefully for a long time and is close to the edge of its container. She said, "You countersigned the promise." He said, "Yes, in November of 1813, in this house by a fire, with the snow starting outside, and no witnesses at all. I signed it, and I meant it." She looked at the blank counter-signature line in her father's letter. It was not blank. There was a signature there, added in a clear and unhurried hand, Gideon Prescott. She put the letter down on the table between them. She placed the violet beside it. She looked at her father's handwriting, the L with its long tail, the joke he had made from a deathbed, with the absolute certainty that the man receiving it would find it as serious as anything he had ever written, and she said nothing for a very long time. Then she said, "The estate." "Yours," he said immediately. "It has always been intended to be yours. I held the deed because I could not determine how to return it without explaining why I held it, and every approach I considered made it a gift, and I knew, I had been watching you long enough to understand that you would not accept a gift. The physic garden. Your specimens. I brought them here to preserve them while the house was maintained and waiting. I intended to return them when I returned the house." The dance. He was quiet for a moment. The fire moved. "I had been trying for 2 years to find a method of introducing myself to you," he said. "That is, I had been trying and failing, because every approach I planned felt insufficient to the context or likely to cause you distress before I could adequately explain. I came to the Thornfield Assembly in October because I knew you would be there. I intended to present myself properly, to find a mutual introduction, to begin the conversation in a sensible way." He paused. "And then I heard the laughter, and the plan became irrelevant." She sat with all of it. A floor plan, a physic garden, an empty house maintained for 2 years, a letter countersigned in private with no witnesses, a violet kept in a letter for 3 years by a man who had, apparently, needed no audience for any of it. She said, "You have been very high-handed." "I know it. Buying a house on someone else's behalf without their knowledge is high-handed." "It is. Moving an entire physic garden without telling me it was mine is also high-handed." "Also, yes." She looked at him. He looked back. He did not offer excuses or extenuating circumstances or an explanation of his intentions that was designed to redirect her assessment. He accepted the inventory with the quality of directness she had observed in him from the first, not performing humility, simply present with the fact of what he had done and its description. She said, "You have also," and here she found she needed to be careful, because she was not certain of the ground she was walking onto, "sat in a library with me for 2 weeks reading in comfortable silence, and when 40 people were laughing in a way that was not a public matter, You crossed a room without being asked. And you have kept a pressed violet in a letter for 3 years, by yourself, with no audience. He said, "Those things are not offered as balance." "No," she said. "They are facts. I am cataloguing them. I catalogue things before I draw conclusions." He said, "Of course." She looked at the 2 violets on the table, the one from his letter, faded, the one from hers, more preserved, both kept, both whole. She sat with the 2 letters and the 2 violets on the table between them for a long time. Outside, the October light moved across the terrace and the long grass and the fields below, and inside the morning room the fire settled and the clock on the mantel marked the 1/4 hour, and Imogen sat very still and let the whole shape of it settle into something she could see clearly, rather than only feel. She was a woman who trusted observation over intuition, who checked her conclusions against evidence before committing to them. She had learned that from her father, who had taught her that the cost of a bad conclusion was almost always higher than the cost of waiting for more evidence. She had enough evidence now. She looked at the floor plan, still on the table. For Gideon, as promised, her father's handwriting. The long L. She said, "The estate." He said, "Yours." "I will not accept it as repayment for anything," she said. "My father's life was not a debt. What he did in Lisbon was his choice, and his alone. If he were here, he would say the same." "I know," he said. "I will not accept it as charity." "I know that too." "Then what is it?" He looked at the table, at the 2 violets, at her. He said, "It is yours, that is all it is. It was your home and it should not have been sold, and the only reason it was sold is that my work in Portugal created a set of circumstances that cost your family everything your family had. The money your father borrowed, to fund the work I was doing, to maintain the cover I was using, was borrowed on my behalf. He incurred it for me, and it came due when he was not there to explain the context. That is what happened. The estate is yours because it was always yours, and the chain of events that led to its loss leads directly to me." The room was quiet. She said, "That is the explanation you have been holding?" "Yes." "For 3 years?" "Yes." She let the weight of it sit. She did not rush past it. He had been carrying this, the knowledge of what his work had cost her family, the debt that could not be repaid in money, because money was not the point, the house maintained and waiting, because he could not give it back until he could explain why he was giving it, for 3 years, alone with no audience, with a promissory note signed by himself on behalf of a joke made by a dying man who had trusted him, and with 2 pressed violets that were as close as either of them ever came to sentimentality. She said, "Gideon." He looked at her. She said, "My father would not have wanted you to carry this as though it were a punishment." "I know," he said. "I am not carrying it as a punishment." "Then what are you carrying it as?" He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the window. The light there was clear and direct, the October kind. No warmth in it, but honest, the world showing itself as it was. He said, "As a reason." She looked at him. He said, "I have spent 3 years finding ways to be inconvenient on your behalf that you would not refuse, because you would not have accepted anything I offered if you knew who I was. That is, I am aware it is not a flattering description of the last 3 years." "It is an accurate one," she said. "Yes." He stood. He crossed to the window, and she was reminded, watching him, of the Duke she had seen from across the Thornfield assembly room, a man who moves through space as though he was permitted to take up exactly as much of it as he needed, no performance required. "The house," he said to the window, "is part of what I want to give you, and I am the rest of it, if you will consider it. That is not a graceful way to put it." "It is a direct way," she said. "I find them usually the same." He turned. She looked at him standing at the window with the October light behind him, and she looked at the letters and the violets on the table, and she made her conclusion. She had her evidence. She had had it for several days, if she was honest with herself, catalogued and observed and carefully not yet concluded. The library evenings, the tea set down without asking, the way he had taken the floor plan from her hands without anger, the way he had crouched beside Dora's bed to speak at her level, the promissory note signed by firelight in November with no witnesses. She rose. She crossed the room to him, as he had crossed to her. Not asking permission, not performing the crossing, simply walking to where she had decided to be. She stopped in front of him, and she placed her hand in his, as she had placed it in the Thornfield assembly rooms when 40 people were watching, and she had made the only decision available to her that preserved her dignity, which had been to accept what was offered. This time, nobody was watching. This time she offered first. His fingers closed around hers immediately and without hesitation, and she felt his pulse under the heel of her thumb, rapid, controlled, the pulse of someone who is trying very hard to remain steady and is not entirely succeeding. She looked up at him. She said, "I accept the house as a home, not as a gift and not as repayment." He said, "Yes." "I accept the rest as something to be determined," she said, "as I observe more evidence." He said very quietly, "I will provide as much as you require." She said, "You should know I intend to be thorough." He said, "I counted on it." He brought her hand to his chest, pressed it there, above his heart, flat against the fabric of his coat, and she felt his heartbeat beneath her palm, clear and strong and real, rapid and steady at once, the rhythm of a man who has been waiting a long time for this particular moment and is not certain he can quite trust it yet. She understood that. She pressed her palm more firmly against it in acknowledgement. He drew her in slowly, one arm around her, careful, asking nothing she had not given, and she let her head rest against his shoulder, and neither of them spoke. They stood that way while the fire behind them settled, and the clock ticked and the October afternoon moved its light across the floor. His chin came to rest on the top of her head, unhurried and certain, the gesture of a man who had been patient for a long time, now done with patience and who did not need to say so. She felt something in her chest release. A tension she had held so long she had stopped noticing the effort of it, not dramatically. Simply gone. She thought of her father, in the garden of a house in Lisbon in the September of 1813, pressing 2 violets between whatever pieces of paper he had available, and writing 2 different letters to 2 different people, and trusting, without being able to verify, that both of them would keep what he had sent. She thought, he knew exactly what he was doing. She said, into the wool of his coat, "He knew you would manage it." He said, "He had more confidence in me than I deserved." She said, "His letter said you were the most dogged man he had ever met." A pause. He said, "His exact words were, 'the most dogged man I have met,' and this is not a compliment, but it will prove useful in this instance." She heard the smile in his voice, not performed, not positioned, the real sound of someone amused against their own expectations. She laughed, properly, briefly, with genuine surprise at herself for doing it, and she felt his arm tighten around her, and felt him laughing too, quietly, in the way of someone who did not know they had needed it. The afternoon continued around them, indifferent and warm. 2 years later, Langley Park was itself again. The south wing had been re-roofed in the first spring. The plaster in the ground floor rooms had been repaired, the floors relaid in the passage by a craftsman from Derby who had taken 3 weeks and done it properly. The kitchen garden had been extended along the new west wall, and the physic section along the south-facing brick, transplanted back from Prescott Hall by Imogen and a quiet afternoon in May of the following year, had been enlarged by 4 species new to the county, sourced through the Naturalist Society and formally documented in her name in their annual publication. Margaret Langley had the east bedroom. She had morning light and a view of the lane, and had been heard to observe once that she had always preferred it to the cottage. It was an October afternoon, the air mild and still, the sky a particular washed pale blue that belonged only to October, present and honest, nothing to prove. Imogen was on her knees in the physic section of the kitchen garden, which was where she tended to be in the late afternoon when the light was right, and she had specimens to record. Her journal was open, her pen moving in the small, precise hand her father had taught her, a smudge of soil already on her left wrist above the permanent pale line of the tincture stain. She heard footsteps on the gravel path from the main house and did not turn. Gideon crouched beside her and held out a cup of tea. She had forgotten the tea. She always forgot the tea when she was in the garden with work to do. He had, over the course of 26 months, become exceptionally skilled at judging the precise moment to bring it. Not too early, when she would set it down and let it go cold before she noticed it, and not too late, when she had passed through the productive portion of the afternoon and would have preferred something else. She took the cup. She drank. It was exactly right. He sat down beside her on the grass itself rather than the bench nearby, coat and all, without comment. He looked at what she was drawing. He did not ask what it was. If she wanted to tell him, she would. Under the old oak at the far end of the garden, in the wicker basket she had carried out after luncheon, and positioned in the narrow band of remaining sun, Violet Prescott slept with the complete disregard for dignity available only to infants and very old cats. She was 4 months old. She had her father's eyes, tawny gold, very clear, and Mrs. Halkett had recently observed with the expression of a woman making a careful empirical assessment, her mother's particular quality of examining the world with focused attention until given adequate reason to conclude otherwise. A dog they had acquired in a sequence of events that resisted brief summary came trotting around the corner of the kitchen garden wall, assessed the situation, the basket, the sleeping infant, the 2 adults on the ground, and decided nothing here required his intervention, and went away again. Imogen finished her drawing. She closed the journal. She looked at the garden, the rows of plantain and yarrow and foxglove, the labels in her handwriting, the old brick wall golden in the late afternoon, the smell of turned October soil and leaves beginning to let go, and the tea cooling between her hands. She looked at all of it with the focused, present attention she gave to things that were worth the time. She turned her hand over in her lap, palm up. He put his hand in hers without looking. She closed her fingers around his. They sat in the October afternoon without speaking, while the light moved through its long, slow angle across the garden, and the oak tree dropped its leaves one at a time in the small, unhurried way of something not yet ready to let go. And the world continued around them, ordinary and sufficient, exactly as it was. Stories told with quiet love.
They laughed beneath the chandelier at every thread she tried to hide. She stood alone beside the window, with all her courage held inside. Then you crossed the crowded ballroom and offered me your hand. You never asked me to be rescued. You simply chose to understand. You saw the woman underneath the dress, the whispers and the shame, and in a room that wanted silence, you called me by my name. I kept the violet, you kept the flame. 2 little flowers, 2 hearts unchanged. Through every lonely year apart, you carried home inside your heart. Now every road and every room leads me back to something true. I thought I had lost everything, but I was being led to you.
You saved the garden from the ashes. You kept the labels in my hand. You built a home from what was broken and waited for me to understand. You never asked me to be grateful. You never called it charity. You only held the door wide open and left the choice to me. You knew that love cannot be but I was being led to you. Let the old walls rise again, let the garden bloom in spring, let the past become a doorway to the life we're meant to live. I am not a debt you carry, I am not a promise owed. I am standing here beside you, and together we are home. I kept the violet, you kept the flame. Two little flowers, two hearts unchanged. Through every silence, faithful year, you held my memory close and near. Now every room is filled with light, every shadow fades from view. I thought I had lost my home, but home was waiting there with you. The violet we kept, the promise we knew, the life we found